Welcome to WikiPodcast, and welcome back to our mini-series on contemporary philosophical topics. Today, we're diving deep into something that feels incredibly personal, yet remains one of the biggest mysteries out there: the nature of consciousness and the mind-body problem. You, our listener, shared a comprehensive overview of consciousness from Wikipedia, and our mission in this episode is to really unpack the core ideas and questions surrounding this fundamental aspect of what it means to be human and maybe even other beings.
It's a fascinating arena, isn't it, where our intuitive sense of self just bumps right up against centuries of philosophical debate and all the latest scientific findings.
Yeah, definitely.
Despite all that scrutiny, we're still wrestling with some really fundamental questions.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting with something that seems straightforward, but turns out to be anything but the very definition of consciousness.
Right. Where do you even start?
Well, the word itself in English, conscious, only really took off in the 17th century. And get this, it was initially even used to describe inanimate objects.
No kidding. That's wild.
Yeah. Its roots are in the Latin conscious, meaning knowing with, and conscious stibi, knowing with oneself, that inner sense of knowing that you know.
Ah, okay. And what's intriguing is how that core idea evolved. The Latin conscientia carried a moral weight, referring to shared knowledge with ethical implications.
Like our word conscience today.
Pretty much. Thinkers like Descartes, a central figure in modern philosophy, use conscientia more in line with our current understanding of conscience, though getting a precise definition from him is surprisingly tricky.
Exactly. Then John Locke, around 1690, really laid the groundwork for our modern view, didn't he? Defining consciousness as the perception of what passes in a man's own mind.
He did, yeah. And that definition held a lot of sway for a long, long time.
Right.
It significantly influenced subsequent philosophical thought and even how dictionaries define the term. But here's where it gets really interesting for you. If you look at attempts to define consciousness today, you'll find something like 40 different interpretations based on different functions and experiences.
40? Wow.
Yeah, there's just no single, universally agreed upon meaning. It's kind of fragmented.
40. That really highlights just how multifaceted this is. Modern dictionaries, like Webster's, they point to inward awareness, perception, mental activity, that state of being aware and understanding. Philosophers naturally have their own specialized language. They talk about knowledge in a broad sense, intentionality, the directedness of mental states, introspection, and crucially, phenomenal experience.
Right, the famous what it's like, that subjective quality.
Exactly.
Right. And even the historical metaphors we've used for the mind offer clues, don't they?
How so?
Well, you've got the idea of hidden layers, maybe influenced by early geology, perhaps, or the mind as a container,
Okay.
or William James's enduring image of the stream of consciousness, that sense of a continuous, ever-changing flow of thoughts and sensations.
Oh yeah, that stream metaphor really captures that fluid quality we experience. But it seems the focus has shifted over time, hasn't it? Moving from that emphasis on introspection, that inner examination,
Right, looking inward.
to a broader understanding of simply being aware.
Precisely. Some thinkers, like Stuart Sutherland, were so skeptical of defining consciousness that they suggested it might even be impossible.
Really?
Yeah, arguing that all that truly matters is our awareness of the external world. Then you have Thomas Nagel's influential what it's like argument, which really emphasizes the deeply subjective nature of conscious experience.
Ah, the back question.
Exactly. Think about his question. What is it like to be a bat? It highlights how our own human experience might be fundamentally different from that of another creature and how difficult it is to, bridge that subjective gap.
That what it's like to be a bat thought experiment really hits home the challenge of understanding consciousness beyond our own experience. And this lack of a clear, agreed-upon definition, that must have had a tangible impact on how we research consciousness.
Absolutely. This definitional ambiguity has led to a degree of fragmentation within the field itself. It's been a problem.
So what do researchers do?
Well, that's partly why the term phenomenal consciousness has gained traction in modern consciousness studies. It's a way to refer to all forms of subjective awareness, basically.
Okay, sort of an umbrella term.
Kind of. And a major goal for many neuroscientists now is to identify the neural correlates of consciousness, or NCCs.
NCCs.
Yeah, those specific patterns of brain activity that consistently accompany conscious experience, trying to find the brain signature, if you will.
And there are different schools of thought on how to even approach this search, right? I read about Julian Jaynes, for instance. He was quite critical of simply equating consciousness with experience.
Yes. Jaynes really held on to that more traditional idea of consciousness as what we can introspect, making a clear distinction between that and unconscious cognitive processes.
So for him, consciousness was maybe a smaller part of the mind.
Exactly. He viewed consciousness as a more limited aspect of our mental lives compared to the vast scope of unconscious processing. Cognitive science, on the other hand, tends to focus on the interplay of numerous mental processes. Well, linking consciousness to our sense of selfhood, our feeling of agency, even emotions like regret. You know Daniel Kahneman's work.
Thinking, fast and slow.
Right. His System 1, fast, automatic thinking, and System 2, slow, deliberate thinking, that provides another framework for understanding the interaction between unconscious and conscious mental activity.
It's almost like our minds have these different gears or modes of operation. That makes sense. But then you have these really radical views like consciousness semanticism. What's that about?
Ah, yes. That essentially argues that we should just get rid of the concept of consciousness altogether.
Get rid of it. Why?
Because, the argument goes, it creates more confusion than clarity. It suggests the term itself is the problem, that it's too ambiguous or ill-defined to be useful scientifically or philosophically.
Wow, that's a significant challenge to the entire field.
It is. Meanwhile, in the medical world, level of consciousness has a very pragmatic meaning.
Right, for patients.
Exactly. Referring to a patient's state of arousal and responsiveness, assessed using tools like the Glasgow Coma Scale.
Huh.
So the same word serves very different purposes in different contexts.
Okay, so navigating the definition is a complex task in itself. That naturally leads us into the philosophy of mind and these really big fundamental questions. And you mentioned earlier that physicalism is the dominant position among philosophers today.
That's generally true in contemporary philosophy, yes.
So for our listener who might be newer to this, physicalism at its core is the idea that everything that exists is ultimately physical, matter and energy.
Exactly. The mind, according to this view, isn't some separate non-physical thing, but rather arises from or is identical to physical processes in the brain. It's grounded in the physical world.
Okay. But even with this dominant view, the very coherence of the concept of consciousness remains a point of debate, you're saying.
Oh, absolutely. While most of us have this strong intuitive sense of what consciousness is, some philosophers are skeptical of relying too heavily on that intuition. Gilbert Ryle, for example.
What was his argument?
He argued against the idea of a separate mind, distinct from our observable behavior. He suggested that our mental states are better understood as dispositions to behave in certain ways. The ghost in the machine idea, he called it, critically.
That's an interesting point. If all we ever see is someone... So the actual feeling of seeing the color red, that's P consciousness. And being able to identify it as red and talk about it, that's A consciousness. Okay. Is the key takeaway here that these two might not always go together?
Exactly. That's the crux of a lot of debate. The philosophical thought experiment of philosophical zombies.
Oh, yes. The zombies. Beings that act conscious but aren't.
Right. Hypothetical beings, physically and behaviorally identical to us, but lacking any inner experience, any P consciousness. They'd have A consciousness without P consciousness.
Is that even possible?
Well, Bloch himself, while leaning toward skepticism, acknowledged the conceptual possibility. It really pushes the question of whether access requires phenomenality, and philosopher William Lycan has even proposed a much more granular view, suggesting at least 8 different varieties of consciousness.
8? Wow, that's a lot to keep track of. But then there's also the idea of distinguishing consciousness from its contents. Like Sam Harris put it, at the level of your experience, you are not a body of cells. You are consciousness and its ever-changing contents. It's like the container versus what's inside it.
That's a good way to think about it. And Christopher Tricker used a helpful metaphor from the Zhuangzi.
Oh.
He talks about this mythical bird called of a flock, whose wings are so vast they span the entire horizon. This bird symbolizes consciousness as this immense field, and our individual thoughts, feelings, perceptions are just temporary patterns or parts within that field.
That's a really evocative image, a vast field. Okay. And this brings us, I guess, to the core puzzle, the mind-body problem itself.
The big one.
How do these mental processes, this consciousness we're talking about, actually relate to the physical processes happening in our brains and bodies?
Right. How does mind relate to matter?
And René Descartes famously proposed dualism, this fundamental separation between the immaterial realm of thought, res cogitans, and the material realm of extension, Res extensa.
He did. Descartes believed these two distinct substances interacted somehow, famously suggesting the pineal gland as the point of contact.
Which isn't really accepted now, is it?
No, his specific solution isn't widely accepted today, but his articulation of the problem was hugely influential in shaping Western thought. Dualist approaches generally fall into two main categories now.
Okay, what are they?
There's substance dualism, which maintains that the mind is a fundamentally different kind of stuff than matter, a non-physical substance.
The ghost in the machine.
Kinda, yeah.
Hmm.
And then there's property dualism. This view accepts that the world is fundamentally physical, but argues that physical processes, like brain activity, can give rise to non-physical properties, like subjective experience that can't be reduced to the physical.
So consciousness is like a special feature of the physical brain, but still distinct from the physical matter itself. Not a separate substance, but a separate property.
Precisely. It emerges from the physical, but isn't reducible to it. Then, opposing dualism, we have monist solutions.
Meaning one kind of reality.
Exactly. Monism argues for a single underlying reality. This includes physicalism, which we mentioned the view that everything, including the mind, is ultimately physical.
Right.
Then there's idealism, the perhaps counterintuitive idea that only thoughts or experiences exist, and what we perceive as matter is a kind of illusion or construction of mind.
Wow, that's a mind bender.
It is. And then there's neutral monism, which proposes that both mind and matter are different aspects of some third, more fundamental underlying essence that isn't itself either mental or physical.
Okay, so lots of options under monism too.
Oh, yes. And within each of these broad categories, dualism, physicalism, idealism, neutral monism, there are numerous nuanced theories and variations.
And physicalism, you said, has gained a lot of ground, especially with advances in neuroscience.
Definitely. Thinkers like Gerald Edelman and Antonio Damasio, Daniel Dennett, they've all offered explanations of consciousness grounded in brain activity. And of course, the whole field of artificial intelligence research is exploring the possibility of creating conscious machines, which is implicitly often a physicalist project.
Right, but then you also have some more speculative theories, looking at quantum physics.
Indeed. There are quantum mind theories, like the Orch-R theory proposed by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff.
What does that suggest?
It suggests that consciousness might originate at a quantum level within structures called microtubules inside brain cells. However, it's really important to stress that these quantum mind theories currently lack strong experimental backing and face considerable skepticism within the scientific and philosophical communities.
Right, so they're out there, but not mainstream science yet.
Not yet, no. They're intriguing but highly speculative.
It feels like for every answer we find, 10 new questions pop up. Like the problem of free will. How does our subjective sense of having control over our actions fit within a universe apparently governed by cause and effect?
That's a whole other deep dive.
Well-
Absolutely huge question. And it's closely linked to another tough one, the problem of other minds.
How do we know anyone else is conscious?
Exactly. How can we ever truly know that other people, or animals for that matter, have conscious experiences similar to our own, since all we can ever directly observe is their behavior?
Yeah. The thought experiment of philosophical zombies really brings this problem into sharp focus, doesn't it? Imagine someone who looks and acts exactly like you but has no inner life. How would you ever know?
You probably couldn't, based on behavior alone. It really makes you wonder. The most common answer to the problem of other minds is the argument from analogy. Well, they look and act like me, so it's reasonable to assume they have similar inner experiences.
But as you pointed out earlier, that feels a bit less than definitive, maybe. A bit of a leap.
It does raise questions about the principle of parsimony, the idea that we should prefer simpler explanations. Is assuming hidden inner states the simplest explanation? Daniel Dennett has even argued that the very idea of a true philosophical zombie, one perfectly indistinguishable, is ultimately incoherent. Well, his argument is complex, but essentially suggests that the kind of sophisticated behavior required to mimic consciousness perfectly would necessitate the very processes we associate with consciousness. But ultimately, many believe that consciousness is reflected in our behavior, including, crucially, our ability to communicate our experiences through language.
Which leads us back to qualia, those deeply personal, ineffable qualities of our experiences.
Right.
Like the specific shade of blueness you see or the particular taste of coffee. These seem so central to what consciousness feels like, yet they're incredibly difficult to explain in purely physical terms.
They are indeed central to what philosopher David Chalmers famously called the hard problem of consciousness.
The hard problem.
Yes. How and why do these subjective feels, these qualia, arise from objective physical processes in the brain? The easy problems, relatively speaking, are explaining functions like attention, memory, self-reporting. The hard problem is explaining experience itself.
Got it. And the capacity to experience qualia, to feel things, is often a key consideration in discussions about sentience and, say, animal rights.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
because it suggests the ability to feel pleasure and pain, suffering, and well-being, which are ethically significant.
And finally, in this philosophical maze, there's the question of personal identity. How does our consciousness relate to that persistent sense of I that we feel we are over time? What makes me me from one moment to the next?
Oh, this is a profoundly puzzling area. We tend to have this strong sense of being the same individual throughout our lives, don't we?
Yeah, definitely.
But what exactly constitutes that continuous identity? Is it memory? Psychological continuity?
Hmm.
The physical body? Philosopher Dan Kolak has proposed various forms of individualism,
Like what?
including the mind-bending open individualism, which suggests that maybe, just maybe, all consciousness is ultimately a single unified being experiencing itself from different perspectives.
Whoa.
And Derek Parfit's famous teletransportation paradox really challenges our intuitive notions of identity. Imagine being scanned, destroyed, and perfectly recreated elsewhere. Is that new person you?
I don't know. That's tricky.
Right. And the Buddhist concept of anatta, or no self, offers a radically different perspective, suggesting that there is actually no permanent, unchanging self to begin with.
It really makes you question the very nature of who we think we are. And Jesse Prince's vertiginous question, why am I me and not someone else? That really highlights the fundamental mystery of our individual subjective experience. Why this perspective and not another?
Exactly. Philosopher Christian List even argues that this question poses a significant challenge, a kind of quadrilemma, for many current theories of consciousness. He suggests that certain fundamental metaphysical claims about consciousness might be inherently incompatible.
So we can't have it all, metaphysically speaking.
Something like that, according to his argument. And some thinkers, like Ned Conitzer, even explore the connections between our understanding of identity and our theories of time. Others, such as Ian Hare, propose concepts like perspectival realism to try and reconcile these different aspects of our experience. It's a very active area.
Okay, so philosophy has given us this vast landscape of different ways to think about consciousness. A real intellectual workout. It's fascinating. But what about the scientific approach? It sounds like for a long time, consciousness was considered sort of off limits for scientific inquiry because it's so subjective.
That's right. For much of the 20th century, particularly during the dominance of behaviorism and psychology, studying inner experience was frowned upon. Its inherently first-person characters seemed beyond the reach of objective third-person scientific methods.
But that changed.
Yes. The field of consciousness studies really began to emerge in the 1980s, driven by a desire to bridge this gap through carefully designed psychological experiments, advances in brain imaging, and detailed case studies of altered states of consciousness.
And the scientific approach seems to focus on two main aspects. Is that right? The content of consciousness, what people report experiencing, and the medical understanding of consciousness as it relates to observable behavior and responsiveness.
Exactly. The overarching goal is to develop objective ways to assess consciousness and to understand the underlying neural and psychological mechanisms that give rise to it.
So how do they measure it?
Well, verbal report, where subjects describe their inner experiences, is a crucial tool in psychological experiments. Think of classic examples like the Necker cube illusion.
Right, that image that can look like a cube viewed from one angle or another, and it flips back and forth in your perception.
Exactly. Your report tells the researcher which interpretation you're consciously experiencing at that moment.
But relying on verbal reports has its limitations, doesn't it? It assumes people can accurately describe their experiences, which isn't always easy. And of course, it excludes beings without language, like animals or infants. And then there's that persistent question of philosophical zombies. Could they, hypothetically, give perfectly coherent verbal reports without having any actual inner experience?
Precisely. Those are all valid challenges. Philosopher Daniel Dennett proposed heterophenomenology as a methodological approach to deal with this.
Heterophenomenology.
Yeah, it basically means treating these vocal reports as data, as reports about experiences to be analyzed rigorously without making initial assumptions about their truthfulness or their direct correspondence to some inner reality. You study the reports themselves.
Okay, that's one way. And medical assessment.
Medical assessment takes a more comprehensive approach, looking at a combination of verbal behavior if possible, levels of arousal, brain activity, often measured through EEG, and purposeful movement, especially in situations where verbal communication isn't possible. Tools like the Glasgow Coma Scale provide a standardized way to assess a patient's level of consciousness based on these observable signs.
And for nonverbal subjects like animals.
Tests like the mirror test to see if an animal recognizes its own reflection, and assessments of contingency awareness, understanding cause and effect, are used to probe self-awareness.
Got it. And then there's the ongoing quest you mentioned earlier, finding the neural correlates of consciousness, the NCCs, those
Oh.
specific patterns of brain activity.
Right. Brain imaging technologies like electroencephalography, EEG, and functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, are absolutely essential tools in this research. Scientists look for brain activity that changes specifically when a person's reported conscious experience changes.
And what have they found? Any hotspots?
Well, early ideas often focused on high-frequency gamma band oscillations in the brain and their potential role in the binding problem.
Blinding.
Yeah, how our brains integrate all the different aspects of a sensory experience, like the color, shape, and movement of an object, into a single, unified conscious perception. How does it all get bound together?
Yeah.
While gamma waves are still considered important, it's become clear that activity in primary sensory areas alone isn't sufficient for consciousness. You can have activity there without being aware of the stimulus.
So it's more complex than just sensory input.
Much more. Higher-level brain regions, particularly the prefrontal cortex, involved in executive functions like planning and decision-making, and also top-down processing, where our expectations and prior knowledge influence perception, are now seen as more likely candidates for being crucial.
So information flowing back from higher areas influences awareness.
Seems likely. Nikos Logothetis' work on binocular rivalry in the temporal lobe has also provided significant insights. That's where two different images presented to each eye compete for conscious awareness, and you can track the brain activity associated with whichever image is currently winning.
Fascinating. So it's likely not one single consciousness center in the brain, but rather a distributed network of activity.
That's the prevailing view now, yes. It seems to involve widespread, coordinated activity across different brain regions. And researchers are even looking at how changes in neural responses, like the rate at which neurons fire and the synchrony of their firing, correlate with the intensity of our conscious experiences.
And that perturbational complexity index, or PCI, you mentioned, that sounds like a fascinating attempt to actually measure the level of consciousness.
It is. The PCI involves using magnetic pulses, TMS, to briefly stimulate the brain and then measuring the complexity of the resulting electrical activity using EEG.
And more complex means more conscious.
Generally, yes. A more complex, widespread, and differentiated response is thought to indicate a higher level of consciousness.
Yeah.
It's proving quite useful, particularly for assessing consciousness in non-communicative patients with brain injuries.
And what about evolution? Comparing brains?
Yes, evolutionary approaches also contribute. By comparing brain structures across different species, like mammals and birds, researchers try to identify brain regions or network properties that might be essential for consciousness. Gerald Edelman's distinction between primary consciousness,
Simple awareness.
right, simple awareness of the present, which many animals might have, and higher order consciousness.
Awareness of being aware. Self-consciousness.
Exactly, often linked to language and a sense of self across time, perhaps more unique to humans. That distinction is useful here. And a 2016 study pointed towards a potential consciousness triad
A triad.
involving specific regions in the brainstem, the rostral dorsolateral pontine tegmentum, bit of a mouthful, and its connections to key cortical areas, specifically the insular cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. These areas seem crucial for maintaining arousal and integrating information, suggesting they might play a pivotal role.
It really feels like we're still in the early stages of mapping this out neuroscientifically. And then there are all these different theoretical models of consciousness that try to explain how it all works, right? You mentioned a few.
Absolutely. There's a whole zoo of theories out there. You have Bernard Barr's global workspace theory.
The theater metaphor.
Exactly. Unconscious processes are backstage. Conscious processes are the spotlighted performance on stage, broadcast widely to the rest of the unconscious audience in the brain.
Okay.
Then there's Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory, or IIT.
What's the core idea there?
IIT proposes that consciousness arises from the brain's capacity for complex information processing. Specifically, it argues consciousness is identical to the amount of integrated information, a system can generate a mathematical measure called phi. The more integrated and differentiated the information processing, the higher the level of consciousness, or phi.
That sounds very mathematical. Is it widely accepted?
It's influential but also quite controversial, partly because it implies consciousness could exist in systems very different from brains if they have high phi, and because measuring phi is incredibly difficult.
Right. And you mentioned the quantum one again, ORCH.
Yes, the orchestrated objective reduction theory from Penrose and Hameroff, positing quantum-level processes in microtubules within neurons. Still highly speculative, as we said.
Another.
There's Michael Graziano's attention schema theory, which suggests that awareness isn't a thing itself, but essentially a simplified model that our brain constructs to represent its own state of attention, like a user interface for our own focus.
Interesting. So awareness is the brain's model of attention.
Kind of, yeah. Then there's the entropic brain theory, exploring how psychedelic states, characterized by altered consciousness, might reflect a less constrained, more entropic or disordered brain state compared to normal waking consciousness, which is seen as more ordered and predictive. There's also the projective consciousness model, PCM, which links consciousness to active inference, the idea that the brain constantly predicts sensory input. And even the colostrum.
A specific brain part.
Yes, a thin sheet of neurons deep within the brain. Francis Crick and Christoph Koch proposed it might act like a conductor of an orchestra, rapidly integrating information across different brain regions to give rise to unified conscious experience.
It's a really diverse and sometimes conflicting set of ideas trying to explain the how and the fundamental question of the biological function and evolution of consciousness. Why do we even have it? That's still a major point of discussion, isn't it?
Oh, hugely.
Yeah.
Did consciousness evolve for a specific reason, or is it more of a byproduct of having a complex brain?
Was Huxley right, the epiphenomenalism idea?
Some still argue for epiphenomenalism, the idea that consciousness is just a causally inert byproduct of brain activity, like the steam whistle on a locomotive. It makes noise, but it doesn't drive the train.
But that feels counterintuitive, doesn't it? Like our feelings do affect our actions.
Exactly. William James offered an evolutionary counterargument. If consciousness has been preserved by natural selection over millions of years, it must serve some adaptive function and thus have some causal impact on our behavior. Otherwise, why would evolution keep such a complex, energy-intensive process?
Good point. But when did it emerge?
That timeline is also heavily debated. Did it start with early vertebrates? Only with mammals? Or even more recently, maybe linked strongly to human language? Estimates vary wildly.
And this idea of an integration consensus, you mentioned that conscious states somehow involve the integration of diverse neural activities. That seems like a recurring theme.
It is. Gerald Edelman's dynamic core hypothesis fits here too, the idea that consciousness involves a constantly shifting but integrated pattern of neural activity. Consciousness seems to involve both differentiation, many different states are possible, and integration. It forms a unified whole. But as you noted earlier, it's still not entirely clear what specific information gets consciously integrated or what the precise causal role of this integration actually is.
It's still fuzzy.
It is. And the challenge of determining consciousness in non-human animals really highlights these difficulties.
Right, back to the bat or the dog or the octopus.
Exactly. Although the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness in 2012 was significant. It represented a consensus among a prominent group of neuroscientists that many non-human animals, including all mammals and birds and even octopuses, possess the necessary neural substrates for conscious experience.
So the hardware seems to be there in many species.
The basic hardware, yes. Peter Carruthers has proposed that consciousness might provide an adaptive advantage by allowing us to distinguish between appearance and reality to know when we're being fooled by perception.
That sounds useful.
It does. However, others suggest that a non-conscious zombie could potentially achieve the same functional benefits through complex computation, leading back to the idea that consciousness might be an exaptation.
An exaptation, what's that again?
A trait that evolved for one purpose, or as a side effect, but later became useful for another. So maybe consciousness arose as a byproduct of increasing brain complexity or language development, and only later found adaptive uses. Or maybe its function is still debated. The role of language in the development of higher-order consciousness is also a significant area of inquiry.
Okay. And then we have altered states of consciousness, everything from sleep and dreaming to the effects of drugs, brain damage, meditation. These really show us how profoundly our conscious experience can be changed, don't they?
Absolutely. These altered states provide invaluable natural experiments for studying the neural correlates of different conscious experiences. For example, dreaming exhibits distinct patterns of brain activity compared to non-dream sleep, even though both are unconscious in the sense of being unreceptive to the world.
And drugs.
Psychoactive drugs can dramatically alter our perception, thought processes, sense of self by affecting brain chemistry, particularly neurotransmitter systems like serotonin, dopamine, etc. Studying these effects helps us understand the chemical basis of consciousness.
And meditation.
Research continues to explore the physiological and neurological changes that occur during various meditative practices, often linked to changes in attention, self-awareness, and emotional regulation. Charles Tart's component process model, back in the day, attempted to break down these altered states into various psychological and physiological components, and questionnaire-based studies have been used to investigate the subjective experiences induced by drugs.
And the medical perspective on consciousness is really focused on assessing and treating patients with altered levels of consciousness, especially after brain injury or during illness, right? Using things like the Glasgow Coma Scale.
Yes, exactly. Accurately diagnosing and managing disorders of consciousness, which exist on a spectrum from locked-in syndrome, conscious but paralyzed, through minimally conscious state, persistent vegetative state, chronic coma, and finally brain death is an active and critical area of medical research. Differentiating between these states can be very challenging, but has huge implications for prognosis and treatment.
And even conditions where awareness itself seems impaired.
Right. Conditions like anosognosia, where individuals lack awareness of their own neurological deficits. For example, someone with hemispatial neglect might ignore one side of space and deny anything is wrong, or someone with Anton-Babinski syndrome might be cortically blind, but vehemently deny being blind. These are considered disorders of consciousness, affecting self-awareness.
Wow, okay. And finally, when we look beyond typical adult humans, what about consciousness in children?
Well, it seems clear that infants have some form of consciousness, but the development of more complex aspects like introspective awareness or autobiographical consciousness, remembering yourself as the subject of past experiences, seems to emerge later, often linked to language development and acquiring a theory of mind.
Theory of mind being.
The ability to understand that others have their own thoughts, beliefs, desires, intentions, which are different from one's own. This usually develops around ages 4 to 5 and seems related to the development of more sophisticated self-awareness.
And then the really challenging issue of consciousness in animals and artificial intelligence. We're back to Nagel's "What is it like to be a bat," aren't we?
We really are. The problem of other minds is particularly acute when it comes to animals, given the language barrier. But as we mentioned, the Cambridge Declaration signaled a broad scientific agreement that many animal species likely possess the neural structures necessary for conscious experience, at least primary consciousness. Griffin's work arguing from behavioral complexity also supports this.
And AI machines.
The possibility of consciousness in artificial intelligence has been a recurring theme for centuries, really, from ancient myths like the golem to early computing pioneers. Ada Lovelace famously expressed skepticism about whether Babbage's analytical engine could truly originate thought, arguing it could only do what it was programmed to do.
And the Turing test.
Alan Turing's imitation game, the Turing test, remains a well-known proposed benchmark for machine intelligence. Can a machine convince a human interrogator it's human? But does passing it mean genuine understanding or consciousness? John Searle's famous Chinese room argument challenges that directly.
Right, the idea that manipulating symbols according to rules doesn't equate to understanding the meaning of those symbols.
Exactly. He argues against strong AI, the claim that a sufficiently complex computer program would be a mind. More recently, researchers have even proposed robotic versions of the Turing test involving physical interaction and other measures like Argonoff's philosophical judgment test as potential ways to assess machine consciousness in the future. But it remains deeply contested territory.
It really feels like we've only just begun to scratch the surface of this incredibly deep and complex topic. And that idea of the stream of consciousness from William James, that continuous flow of thoughts and feelings that resonates so much.
It does, doesn't it? And interestingly, it even has parallels in Eastern philosophy, like the Buddhist concept of siddhasatthana, or mind stream, which also emphasizes the flowing, transient nature of mental events.
And it had a huge impact on literature, too, right?
Oh, absolutely. It revolutionized narrative techniques, shaping how authors like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf try to portray the fluid, associative nature of inner experience directly on the page.
And finally, we shouldn't overlook the spiritual or contemplative approaches, should we?
Definitely not. From the explorations of consciousness in the ancient Upanishads to Richard Maurice Buck's concept of cosmic consciousness, Ken Wilber's spectrum of consciousness model integrating psychological and spiritual development, and even modern attempts like linking levels, described in traditions like Radhaswami Satsang to Hameroff's Orshua theory, these offer yet another rich and diverse set of perspectives on this fundamental aspect of being.
Okay, let's really try to distill what this all means for you, our listener. As you can clearly see, the nature of consciousness and the mind-body problem are not simple questions with easy answers.
Not at all.
They've engaged some of the most brilliant minds for centuries, and we're still actively grappling with them today. From the intricacies of just defining consciousness itself, to the deep philosophical debates about its relationship to our physical bodies, and all the cutting-edge research trying to map its neural basis, there's a vast and fascinating landscape to explore.
And for you, the learner, the key insight here is probably the sheer breadth of perspectives and the fundamental challenges involved in understanding something so central to our experience.
Yeah.
It's not just one field's problem.
Right.
So whether you're preparing for discussions where you need to consider different viewpoints, maybe in philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, even AI ethics, or trying to understand research in these intersecting fields, or maybe you're just driven by your own deep curiosity about the nature of reality, this deep dive should hopefully provide you with a solid framework.
Yeah, a map of the territory, maybe. Something like that. You've seen how the conversation has evolved over time, the crucial distinctions that have been made, like phenomenal versus access consciousness, or the hard versus easy problems, and some of the most compelling and often debated theories that attempt to explain this fundamental aspect of our existence.
So what does all of this mean for your own understanding of yourself and the world around you? Hopefully, this exploration has sparked some new ways of thinking about your own conscious experience and maybe the experiences of others.
Mm.
It really highlights that something as seemingly self-evident as awareness is actually a profound and multifaceted mystery. And it has significant implications across philosophy, science, medicine, and even our understanding of the other beings that share our planet, as well as the potential, however distant, for consciousness in artificial intelligence. And maybe this raises a really important question for you to ponder personally. Given the incredible range of ways to think about consciousness that we've touched on today, from Descartes' dualism to modern physicalism, from IIT to the idea of it being an illusion, which perspective resonates most strongly with you?
Yeah, where do you land on this?
And perhaps more importantly, why? What particular aspect of this whole puzzle, whether it's the mystery of qualia, the implications of the mind-body problem, the search for neural correlates, or the possibility of animal or machine consciousness, what stands out to you as the most compelling or maybe the most perplexing piece? Something to chew on.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for listening. Write us in the comments your opinion on the episode and what other topics you would like us to talk about. Subscribe to the channel to help us reach more listeners. Thank you, and have an amazing day.